Thank you so much for joining us this morning. First of all, let me ask you, from what you see in the laws that set up INEC and compliance, conduct of elections, do you see anywhere in which our laws have captured the peculiarities of conducting an election during a pandemic such as this?
Not really. Certainly, the guidelines that INEC has issued has not necessarily derived from any particular section of the existing electoral law or the Constitution. But the reality, of course, is that there is no prohibition of the guidelines that INEC has clarified and set out. Of course, INEC has in its meetings come up with these guidelines. The expectation, of course, is that these guidelines are being reviewed by different other stakeholders, civil society, political parties, the security agencies, particularly the police, who would be involved in helping to implement the guidelines. And the hope is that as we review these guidelines, as the elections approach, and this is a unique situation, we would be able to make further suggestions or recommendations to INEC on how best these guidelines can work out really effectively. For observers also, it's a question, what is the best way that you can observe elections to be able to truly and honestly state what you have observed? So I think it's still a lot of work to happen. Stakeholders have to look at what INEC has put out, be able to make suggestions to INEC on if there is a need, how to improve the guidelines that INEC has issued.
This perhaps is going to raise some other issues for legal practitioners such as yourself, because from what you say, if, as you say, the laws didn't capture the peculiarities, yet the INEC as an organization has to come up with guidelines that may or may not be factored into law. These exigencies, is it in any way against any law that such that we can say, any lawyer can come up and say, look, this happened during so time, so why should it not happen now? Will those would this kind of peculiarities be factored into law should such an argument occur at a time when there is no pandemic?
Well, like I said, I do not believe that any section or article in this guideline offends the existing laws. I think you can't always capture every circumstance in a law, and certainly with respect to Nigeria, where we often run back to constitutional alteration. Again, this is not one of those circumstances that you can say that you really need a law to enforce the guidelines. The key issue, I think, is really the question, how do you ensure that you do not, by an election, increase the risk of spread of transmittable diseases? And it's not just COVID, it could be really any transmittable disease. And I think that this provides an opportunity to help to deal with this situation. When you look at the system of vote in Nigeria, it requires that people are physically at polling units. It requires that election officials are physically on grounds to administer the different processes of elections. And I think that INEC outlining this is really to say this is some procedure for smoothing the implementation of elections. And we must note that there has been election that has held in this pandemic period in some other parts of the world. And we're quite delighted that INEC has very creatively found a way to go on. Otherwise, it would be unconstitutional if it didn't go on. But to go on with the elections scheduled for Edo on September 19, and of course, subsequently Ondo in October, on October 10th of this year. So I think it's commendable that INEC is thinking proactively and coming up with the best ways to ensure that the pandemic, if it still is locking in November or in September or October, does not continue to spread because of its work.
And that ties to something a lot of public health practitioners say. In fact, we had a microbiologist just moments ago saying if he had his way, then maybe this election should not be conducted. And looking at that policy document that INEC released saying that they will engage relevant authorities to designate election as an essential service to enable the commission function effectively in times of national emergency. So there's that conversation around whether or not this is really expedient. And I'd like you to weigh on it. In this time of a national emergency, global pandemic, some have even said we've not peaked yet. How expedient is electioneering?
Election is part of life, is part of a democracy, is part of how a government runs. And I think that the pandemic is there, but really at the end of the day, a country must be governed, a people must be governed. Government is for the people, and people have a right to make a choice and make a decision. And when you look, which is what puzzles me, we are all victims, and we must understand that. And people in government must understand that the people, including themselves, including all of us, are victims of the current crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic. So everything that is done by government, by institutions, must ensure that the effects, the consequences on people is minimized. And it is an essential responsibility on citizens to go out and vote. So I do not agree with anybody who suggests that votes should not happen because there is the crisis of COVID-19. Yes, the crisis is there, and we must commend INEC for thinking out the best way to ensure that the essential responsibility of citizenship is exercised in this period. And I think for all of us, it's a question, how do we ensure that this implementation of responsibility is carried out effectively? So INEC has mentioned the security services, the police, I must say, who have a responsibility to train, to prepare for a vote in a pandemic. And I think it's not just INEC. The police services have to come to some conclusion on how to train personnel to manage people during elections. And I don't mean beating up people, brutalizing people. We're all victims of COVID-19 pandemic situation. So the police services, the security services, observers, INEC must prepare to handle this situation in a special way to ensure that the essential service of votes to bring accountable public officials or elected officials who seek a revalidation or seek new votes, that this happens without denigrating on one of the essential tenets of democracy, which is renewal of choice, renewal of votes, or indeed voting anew elected officials.
Obviously, training and retraining will play a major role in that. And one thing that I noticed in that policy is the fact that for the first time, for example, INEC is working together with NCDC to conduct elections. But you also see the array of things that INEC has to purchase, like infrared thermometers, face masks for all their officials, by the way, sanitizers and other necessary equipment. There's also the training of INEC officials, training of other people, the security agencies and all that. And the big question is funds. How do you, because I want to believe that INEC did not see this coming, so they probably did not budget for this. How do you see us tackling that issue of funding, especially because we're counting down to September and October to conduct these polls? And preparation should have started at this point.
Well, I think it's a question of how INEC reallocates votes that it has at the present time. And if it finds that there is a need for additional funding, then approach the executive approaching the National Assembly to seek some environment of funds to INEC to be able to conduct this election. I proceed from the basis that elections in this country are far too expensive, and there must be some way of cutting down on cost of elections in this country. So I think that INEC must recognize, of course, that there is the challenge of funding at this time and work out the best modalities of environment of funds within existing accounting heads, but perhaps even managing resources in a very prudent manner. But the National Assembly has a responsibility to take into account any request by INEC should there be need for additional funds. But we must also look at the responsibility of citizens, because in the policy document, INEC talked about its officials citizens themselves must also recognize that there are existing protocols for safety in the public place and must prepare themselves to be able to participate in this. The political parties must prepare themselves that their agents are provided with necessary PPE kits to be able to participate effectively in the elections and ensure that everybody is protected. So we expect that when people are going to the polling units to vote, that they wear face masks, they are able to provide for themselves hand wash sanitizers and so on. We expect that everybody who is going out to vote, and it's the responsibility of political parties who are campaigning and contesting in these elections to enlighten people on what they need to do. For election observers as well, we will have the responsibility to enlighten people on preparations for actual vote on polling days. So there's a lot of responsibility on everyone. But the key thing, I think, is that the democratic right of citizens to vote in elections is preserved even in a pandemic.
To explore that issue, talking about our elections being too expensive. And I mean, obviously, you have said that INEC might look into cutting down costs in some areas. I wonder what INEC would say to that. But looking at that, what areas do you think INEC can actually cut down costs? I'm not sure if INEC officials can work from home like other people have tried to do, but what areas do you think this pandemic, provides for us to look into in cutting down costs?
Well, I think that, again, you have to have some means of collation of votes. And INEC has tried to experiment on collation electronically without necessarily having this as a formal process and part of the election process. And of course, we have to go back to the Electoral Act to ensure that amendments are made to enable some form of use of electronic system in voting. And I'm not talking about electronic voting machine, because those are going to be really, really very expensive to implement. I'm talking of existing mechanisms that INEC has at this time to collate votes. This should be able to trigger in and be possible that it is formalized and accepted as part of the election guidelines and processes. So I think that the National Assembly needs to go back to the question of the Electoral Act, and the National Assembly has been very slow in dealing with amendments that have already been made by it, but not that have lapsed. The work is virtually done. The National Assembly needs to just really go back and look at how to brush it up and ensure that it goes through passage and becomes part of our law. This would help INEC tremendously as it prepares for future elections, because some of the aspects of election being made to be electronic, the use of technology increased, would help significantly in reducing the cost of elections in this country. But certainly, elections in this country are far, far too expensive. And I think that there must be some convening to understand how best to ensure that elections are made cheaper in Nigeria.
Well, the costs of elections are borne by INEC as an institution and, of course, the political parties as well. But let me back up a little bit from before the election to electioneering, voting, beg your pardon, campaigning, primaries, and all of that. Political campaigns are usually done with crowds. And you'd also, of course, recall the hue and cry that trailed that rally that took place in Oyo State by the People's Democratic Party. How do you see that playing out at this time, especially as we march towards the elections in Edo and Ondo states?
It's going to be a challenge, and I think it calls into play the role of the health institutions, NCDC and Ministry of Health and so on, to be able to, and INEC actually, to be able to develop protocols for campaigns in a pandemic. And I think it's something that behoves all of us, how to ensure that candidates for elections are known by voters. Voters make a choice based on the knowledge of those that they are voting for. The political parties have a responsibility to find how best to send out the message about who the candidates they are sponsoring for elections are. And I think that we also have to look at political parties. Part of the biggest challenge that the 2019 elections faced was to see 90-something political parties presenting presidential candidates. 70-something presenting presidential candidates for elections when a lot of them had no preparations, had no capacity to campaign, had no capacity to even push forward the candidates, which takes us to the question, who should be on the ballot for any elections? Should anybody who can find a name and have INEC register that name jump on the ballot? Again, it calls into question the amendments regarding the Electoral Act. It should be possible that people can register political parties, campaign on the issues as political parties, but not be on the ballot. There must be a qualification for a party to be on the ballot and not just a name and a registration. They must meet certain criteria to be on the ballot. So overall, reducing the number of political parties running on any particular elections by ensuring that they qualify to be on the ballot, even if they're registered as political parties. But beyond that as well, we must outline criteria for campaigns, taking into account public health concerns, especially in a pandemic situation as we have today. But we really should not let the situation be a free-for-all that people can campaign without the challenges that a pandemic creates.
Well, the guidelines will probably be come up with by the INEC and maybe COVID-19, PTF COVID-19 and all of that. But if you were to, I know it's very expensive to be a consultant, but if you were to offer free consulting for any political party wishing or hoping to hold a campaign, what would you counsel them to do?
Well, at this time, I mean, PLAC, Policy and Legal Advocacy Center, does a lot of work and makes up policy presentations on this that is available for use by INEC, by the National Assembly, by political parties. And I think that for a lot of the political parties, what we are suggesting is that there is an important need for limited campaigns, which means that rather than organize statewide campaigns, because you see political parties talk about the grand rally, the giant of all rallies, holding statewide rallies. I think that political parties should hold restricted rallies in small communities rather than in trying to involve large communities. Two, there's a need for increased use of electronic advertisements so that candidates themselves can use radio, can use social media, can use television to reach out to people as widely as possible. There are different means of communication that exist in this country, that exist as a result of the improvements in communication in the world. And I think that the political parties need to exploit and explore all of these communication tools to reach out to citizens. And as part of the protocol on campaign that should be developed, this all needs to be taken into account, but we should not under any circumstance allow political parties to get into a situation where it's a free-for-all, where you organize rallies without concern about the safety of those you have invited to listen to you at those rallies.
Well, there are two. One of the things that comes to me from what you just said now is, okay, maybe vote buying is going to take a big hit, but then we'll come back to that subsequently. And also the issue of e-voting that you kind of, rubbed off a little on. We'll come back to it, so please stay with us. We still have Clement Nwankwo, Executive Director of PLAC, with us. There's this issue that has been on the burner for many years, and that's the issue of e-voting. By e-voting, we mean the whole gamut. For this pandemic, however, for this peculiar time, INEC has said it will adopt electronic platforms for the submission of nomination forms by political parties in the governorship elections, as well as in recruiting its ad hoc staff for election duty. Well, how desirable and in alignment with the laws of the land is that?
Well, the laws at this time do not prohibit electronic voting. Indeed, the Electoral Act is quite clear that you could adopt electronic voting. But also the Electoral Act has provisions that mandate manual voting. And indeed, the definition of the process of election in the Electoral Act as it stands clearly has not further expanded on the process and procedure for achieving electronic voting. But I think that countries around the world have different experiences with electronic voting. There are countries where, in fact, electronic voting is specifically prohibited. And this includes countries like the Netherlands, where this was experimented upon, and the experience was resulted in the prohibition of electronic voting. In some countries, it's a mix. In one of the largest, indeed the largest democracy in the world, which is India, electronic voting is actually what takes place. But India's experience is highlighted by the fact that India is one of the most technologically advanced countries in the world. India produces its own electronic voting machines at extremely cheap costs by state-owned companies. So you can't compare that. When we talk about electronic voting in Nigeria, and you can look at even the process of registration of voters that we embarked on, where we had to bring in the direct data capture machines, some of it imported from China, some of it from India. The cost of it was humongous. So countries that have, like India, that have implemented it almost 100%, is because it's exceedingly cheap in India to produce and implement this. And the level of technological savviness in India is incredibly high. The question we must ask ourselves in Nigeria is, do we have the resources to implement a full electronic voting system? And again, what is it that informs shift from one procedure to the other? There must be trust. In this country, the level of trust is exceedingly very low. And so people are going to ask questions. The issue of electronic voting in this country, the controversy around it did not start today. If you remember, if you remember, in the Second Republic between 1979 and 1983, there were conversations to the point that you had professors, and if a lot of us who remember Professor Dele Awujo, you remember the demonstrations he showed that indicated that you could vote for one political party and the machine could manipulate the results to transform into vote for another political party. And this happened even as an example in the US during, if you remember, the controversial votes that were conducted in the US, the Florida issue. All of these are challenges that the electronic system faces. In some countries, nobody even talks about electronic voting. In Germany, which is one of the best technological systems in the world as well, they don't even have a conversation about electronic voting. And ballot papers, and this is where I talk about cost of elections. Ballot papers are simply cyclo-styled or photocopied papers that people use to vote. In this country, we spend, even with the manual one that we're using right now, this country spends an incredible amount of money taking money out abroad to producers abroad to produce ballot papers of what is sometimes tried to be made to be of currency value.
That's definitely something of concern, Mr. Wankwo. But very, very quickly, there was something you raised the other time. You said we do not have the resources to deploy, to spend or to invest in electronic voting. Just what do you mean by that, really?
Electronic voting is very, very, very expensive. And in this country where procurement issues are always a challenge, we know how much this country spent, how many billions of naira was spent to procure just registration of voter machines, the DDC machines, the direct data capture machines that were used beginning from the 2011 elections. It was a major challenge being able to procure this. And the country had to be running helter-skelter to China, to India, at extremely high cost to produce this. Those machines have a lifespan, and I believe that that lifespan perhaps has now come to haunt us, because we have to think what to do about those machines that have lived out their lifespan. So you have the challenge of the cost of it. And in a situation where our GDP is going down, where income is reducing, where revenues are reducing, I do not think that we can begin to talk about the systems, because electronic voting systems are two types. You have the types where you can sit in the comfort of your home and use your iPhone, your iPad, your laptop, and vote by internet. And then you have the other system where you have the machines actually installed in the polling units, and people come and press particular buttons and the votes go to where they should go in a normal situation. Now, the question is, are we prepared for the first one, which is the internet-based electronic voting system? Do we have the infrastructure? Do we have an internet-based system that can enable people in the remotest parts of this country to vote by their telephone, by their computer or laptop? The answer is no. That would be the cheaper one. Do we have the trust in ourselves, in the system, to enable people to trust that internet-based voting is acceptable? It's a challenge, and we've had recent experiences, and one of the ones that should actually capture our attention is the recent experiences of the Nigerian Bar Association with voting in their election.
Well, Mr. Wankwo, it's interesting, many things that many issues that you're raising now. Question of, is it which one then should we go for? Should we stay with what we have and continue to expend these monies, or do we have a hybrid of the two that you have mentioned, or do we come up with something that is unique to us? There are many questions that we could have loved to engage you on, but we really have to thank you very much for the time and perspectives that you've shared with us this morning. Clement Wankwo is Executive Director of PLAC. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.